Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. Before the Nile's edge turned golden with sunrise, before a single reed shook in the breeze or a bird called out to the sky, there was movement behind the sandstone walls of the temple. You might not hear it. The world was still. But inside, in a small stone chamber not far from the inner sanctum, a priest was already awake, his body freshly scrubbed, his scalp bare and glistening, his arms, chest, legs smooth as polished ivory, and beneath the flickering flame of a quiet oil lamp, he reached for a sharp bronze blade. In ancient Egypt, to serve the gods meant shedding more than ego or desire. It meant removing the very markers of your body, hair, sweat, scent, and imperfection. The priests of major temples, like those of Amen in Thebes or Ptah in Memphis, lived under rules as strict as any royal guard. And for those who served in the most sacred spaces, the Wabit or pure place, the day began long before the city stirred, not with prayer, but with shaving every part of the body, every single day, because in the eyes of the gods, hair was not a symbol of beauty or maturity. It was a pollutant, a sign of chaos, of uncontrolled nature. In a world defined by the cosmic order, the presence of chaos near a divine object was not only an insult, but a danger. You might wonder, how did a civilization with so many images of proud plaited wigs and beaded hairpieces grow to fear real hair? The answer lies in a tension between outer display and inner purity. Egyptian temples were carefully regulated machines of ritual. From the architecture to the staff hierarchy, everything served a purpose. Every chamber had meaning. Every sound was measured. Every gesture, from offering incense to pouring water on a statue, had to follow strict prescription, and to be pure enough to enter the holiest space of all, where the god's cult statue resided, required absolute bodily cleanliness, not metaphorically, but physically, real, tangible, clean. The priest's day began not with tea, not with meditation, but with the scraping of skin. The tools were simple, small bronze or copper razors, often curved or squared, fitted into handles. They were honed with river stones and stored carefully beside ointments and linen. Some priests used pumice stones after shaving to smooth the skin further. Others had assistants, lower-ranked initiates, who helped them reach the back or scalp. But shaving wasn't the only demand before entering the temple. The priest had to wash repeatedly in pools built outside temple walls. Cold water from the Nile was used to rinse sweat, oil, or anything that might carry human scent. They would often do this 4 times per day: sunrise, noon, afternoon, and night. They trimmed their nails. They avoided strong-smelling foods like garlic or onion, and they wore only linen, the fabric believed to be clean, unlike wool, which came from animals and retained odor and impurity. And still, all this was not enough. Before each ritual, the priest would stand outside the naos, the small inner shrine, and declare his purity aloud in speech, as if persuading not just the gods, but himself. I am pure. I have not stolen. I have not defiled myself. I have not committed sin. I am pure. Over and over, the declaration was made like a mantra, but more judicial than spiritual, because purity in ancient Egyptian temples was not merely about the soul, it was about protocol. Inside the temple of Amen at Karnak, the largest religious complex ever constructed, these rituals were magnified. High priests had hierarchies of subordinates, Some shaved daily, others weekly. Some could only enter certain courts, only a few the most senior, had access to the god's actual statue, and it was not seen as a privilege. It was a duty, a burden to enter the presence of the divine, a thing carved from precious stone, clothed in linen and gold, hidden behind multiple doors. The priest had to perform a ritual waking, as if the god himself had been sleeping. He would offer food, pour water, fan incense, and even dress the statue, all while singing hymns and reciting words that had remained unchanged for centuries. But before any of that, he shaved. Shaving was not simply an act of cleaning. It was a symbolic return to the moment of birth, a state before puberty, before desire, before decay. Even the eyebrows and eyelashes, in some orders, were removed. A face devoid of all hair was a sign not of beauty, but of control, of asceticism, of readiness, and to leave a single patch of hair was to risk offending the gods with their human dashness, so he would scrape, methodically, quietly, in the same direction, over the same patches, till his skin turned raw. Some priests used scented oils after the razor, myrrh, or frankincense to soothe the sting. Others bore the itch in flaking skin as a mark of commitment. And then, after this quiet, painful, repetitive ritual, the priest would wrap himself in clean linen, white, tightly pleated, soft and dry, not for vanity, but because wool, sticky, smelly, derived from animals, was unclean. Even the sandals were carefully chosen, often papyrus, sometimes palm fiber, never leather. 4 leathers came from animals, while their symbolism were also impure. You start to see a pattern, don't you? Okay. In ancient Egyptian priesthood, the rejection of hair was just the first in a long series of denials. No sex, no meat, no wine during service, no casual contact with the dead unless part of specific funerary rites. Priests did marry. Many had children, but during their active temple service, sometimes months at a time, they lived in a form of semi-monastic seclusion. In fact, scholars believe this rigorous temple system of purity may have influenced early forms of monastic life in the region, especially among Coptic communities centuries later. But that's a thought for another night. Tonight, you're standing in a chamber at the edge of morning. The priest has finished his final scrape. He applies oil, binds a linen strip around his waist, wraps a folded sash across his shoulder, and steps quietly across the stone floor toward the outer basin. He kneels, scoops water, pours it over his head, again, until he's dripping. Then he dries himself with a plain cloth, never shared, always clean. He steps through the door. The temple is still dark, but the light is coming. In a few moments, he'll stand before the shrine, declare his purity, light the incense, and pull back the linen curtain before the statue. But right now, he pauses. One moment of stillness, his scalp cold, his skin tight, his hands open at his side, in silence. All this for a God who never speaks, but what really was the priest hoping to become by shaving so much of himself away? The temple was awake now, but not in the way cities wake, with clamor and chatter and breakfast carts rolling over stone. No, this was a different kind of waking. The kind where light entered slowly, washing across statues and walls until shadows retreated like servants. The priest walked barefoot across the cool floor, each step deliberate, each breath slow. He passed through a columned hall, massive pillars carved with lotus and papyrus, and entered the periphery of the naos, the sanctuary. No one else followed. Even among the temple staff, few could enter this sacred core. Fewer still could approach the image of the god in his hands. The priest carried a small cloth bundle. Inside, a feather fan, a flask of sacred water, strips of fresh linen, and a narrow blade, not for skin this time, but for food preparation, because the statue of the god, whether Amen, Ptah, or Hathor, was not an ornament. It was a being, a presence, and like any living thing, It had to be woken, washed, dressed, and fed. And only a man with a shaven body, an empty stomach, clean linen, and silence in his heart could do that work. You see, the priests of Egypt weren't just intermediaries. They were caretakers. The gods weren't asked to come down to earth. They were presumed to be here already, always, dwelling in statues carved from rare wood or stone. Their power invoked through daily ritual, not miraculous speech. And if that presence was neglected, if the god wasn't woken properly, if the shrine gathered dust, the offerings were spoiled, then the world itself would tilt toward chaos. The order of the universe was fragile. A cracked vase, a candle too near the curtain, took constant tending, And the body of the priest was both tool and threat in this effort. That's why he shaved. That's why he starved, That's why he moved slowly, spoke little, and washed 4 times a day, because any scent, any impurity, even a stray hair could disrupt the ritual. You might think it extreme, and it was, but imagine this, an entire civilization that treated its gods like sleeping royalty, requiring a butler's finesse, a surgeon's cleanliness, and a poet's silence. No frenzy, no ecstasy, just quiet repetition. Each day, mirroring the last dot inside the shrine, the priest approached the closed doors of the neos. No hinges creaked. The joints were smooth, oiled, designed to be opened without noise. He reached forward, clean hands, fingers slightly curled, and pulled the panels apart. There, the soft flicker of a single oil lamp, stood the statue, polished, serene, dressed in yesterday's linen. The god's face was emotionless, not fearsome, not wrathful, still. And yet, the moment was not casual. It was carefully scripted. Every movement, every phrase had been recorded in temple manuals. Some still exist today, etched into walls or copied onto scrolls. The priest stepped closer, his head bowed slightly, not in worship exactly, but in deference. He began to speak, not in his everyday voice, but in a slow, chanted tone. Words like, "Awake, O great God, the morning has come. The light has returned. You are purified. You are adorned. You are pleased." Each phrase was followed by action, fastening the old linen, wiping the statue with sacred water, fanning it, sprinkling natron, a salty, cleansing mineral to purify any lingering dust. Then, fresh linen, folded precisely, case-sense, lit and circled 3 times, and always, the feather, a long plume, often from an ostrich or heron, used to fan away impurity, to move air without breath, to serve the god without staining him with your exhale. You see, even breath was considered risky. Priest would turn his face slightly away while fanning the statue, not because he feared the god, but because the god was more perfect than human lungs could understand. To bring yourself into that presence required not just intention, but technique. And to that end, the priest followed each step as if his life depended on it, because, in a way, it did. If he failed to cleanse the statue, if the rituals grew sloppy, if the gods felt neglected, famine might come. The river might fail to flood. Enemies might cross the border. The people might die. That was the burden of stillness. The priest must remain invisible, unnoticeable, yet absolutely precise. He finished dressing the statue, tied the sash, offered food, a platter of bread, dates, cucumber, perhaps a bit of honey. Then he recited the final verse. May you be satisfied. May your face be refreshed. May your name be exalted. May your enemies be far. Then, silence. He withdrew, gently shut the nails, and left the shrine backward, never turning his back until he passed the final column. Elsewhere in the temple, junior priests were sweeping the outer courts, lighting more incense, preparing offerings for the public ceremonies that would happen later that day. But none of that compared to what had just taken place, because the real work, the work that ensured cosmic order, had already been done in silence, by a man with no hair, no scent, no words of his own. You might be tempted to think of him as repressed, or institutionalized, or fanatical, but perhaps that's too modern a view. In his mind, the priest was preserving the universe with water, linen, and stillness, and in a way, he was dot because for all its superstition, Egypt endured for thousands of years through drought, invasion, political collapse, and what remained most constant, the temples, still, clean, shaved. You might ask, what happened to the priest after his morning ritual? Did he rest? Did he eat? He did, but not in the temple. He would return to a modest priest's residence nearby. Not a palace, not a hovel. There, he could break his fast, check his skin for razor bumps, prepare his next set of linen. But he could never let his hair grow, even on his day off, even in grief, illness. Because once a priest was initiated into the temple order, his body no longer belonged only to him. It belonged to the god, his purity, to Mahat. And so he lived in constant vigilance, constant shaving, constant stillness. But what would happen if he missed a single day? The temple air never changed. Even as the seasons turned beyond its gates, even as sandstorms whispered across the desert and crocodiles glided through the canals, the sanctuary remained exactly the same, cool, hushed, and immaculately ordered. But imagine now a small fracture in that order. A young priest, perhaps not as meticulous as his teacher. Or perhaps he'd been ill the night before, unable to wake early enough to complete his full body purification. Perhaps it was a nick from the razor, tender skin, too raw to shave. Or maybe he simply forgot. Just a patch, a single overlooked spot behind the ear, sliver of stubble beneath the chin. With the god's notice, he might think not. After all, the rituals were perfect. The incense burned cleanly. The offerings were fresh. He'd washed thoroughly and recited the liturgy without hesitation. And yet, as he entered the naos, something in the air felt different. Not angry, not vengeful, bit tense, as though the god's silence was less serene and more suspicious. In ancient Egypt, omission was as dangerous as action. Forgetting to speak a word in a ritual, or pronouncing it with the wrong intonation, was seen as an invitation for disorder. Sfit, the opposite of manat, chaos, and bodily impurity, even invisible, was no small thing. If a priest entered the sacred space with a single hair unshaven, the consequences weren't theatrical. No fire from the sky or crumbling statues. But there would be a record. The sesh per Ankh, the scribes of the temple, documented everything. And if another priest noticed, or if an offering failed to be accepted, a sign might be flies refusing to land on it, or the lamp's flame sputtering strangely. An inquiry might be opened. Punishments could be strict. Suspension, fines, dismissal. Not because the priest was evil, but because the world was fragile. Egyptian religion was practical in that way. The gods didn't demand piety, they demanded protocol. Not belief, but behavior. And shaving wasn't symbolic, it was structural. Without daily removal of hair, sweat might linger. Lice might hide. Bacteria could fester in crevices near the groin, under the arms, between the toes. You are not just presenting yourself to a deity. You are becoming a tool for maintaining universal order. An unclean tool might break the system. So imagine our young priest, shaken after his oversight. He returns to his chambers and scrubs harder that night, uses sharper blades, plies natron longer, just every hair fall like grains of sand, one by one, onto the basin stone. And then he begins again the next morning. Earlier this time, because routine was everything. In fact, the role of a temple priest wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even particularly spiritual by modern standards. Most of their time was spent managing inventory, distributing offerings to temple workers, and overseeing agricultural lands owned by the temple. Priests were administrators, not mystics. They tracked barley shipments, inspected linens, collected taxes from villages under the temple's jurisdiction. Shaving. That was simply the entry ticket to the job. But over time, it became something else. A rhythm, a discipline, a form of self-erasure. Because in a society as stratified and eternal as Egypt's, the greatest danger wasn't pain or death, it was disorder. Personal ego, hair, vanity, all of these were threats. By shaving daily, priests reminded themselves, I am not myself. I am function. I am cleanliness. I am silence in human form. And that's why the shaving wasn't just of the head or the beard. It extended to the arms, the chest, the legs, even the pubic region. Every part of the body that could betray its animal nature was stripped clean. Egyptian razors were made from copper or bronze, hammered into delicate curves. They dulled quickly. A priest might use 2 or 3 in a single week, keeping them wrapped in cloth and polished with sand. We've even found razor kits buried in tombs, suggesting that even in death, the purification continued. Because to enter the next world, the duat, a priest, had to be clean, not just of sin, but of hair. Even the gods were shown as smooth-skinned, untouched by time or dirt, and if you believe the afterlife was just a more permanent version of daily life, then shaving wasn't just a chore, it was preparation for eternity. There are even temple instructions, still preserved on stone, that say a priest must purify himself by removing every impurity from his body, by shaving the hair of his limbs, his head, and all his secret places, and by bathing in the water of the lake. And so it was, day after day, decade after decade, each priest, young or old, shaving by moonlight before the temple opened. Quietly, you might wonder, did they ever rebel? Did anyone one day say, no, I won't do it today. I am tired of scraping this blade across my thigh. I am tired of living without scent, without softness. Perhaps they did, but those men would not remain priests for long, because the temple wasn't just a job, it was a machine. A clockwork of rituals that needed every gear to be flawless. And the shaved priest, he was one of the smallest cogs, but perhaps also one of the most important. You might pass by an ancient Egyptian relief today, maybe at Karnak or Luxor, and see a row of priests carved in profile, bald heads, linen skirts, staffs in hand. You'll think this is what piety looked like. But you'd only be half right, because piety didn't live in the face, or even in the prayer. It lived in the razors, in the water bowls, in the quiet moments before dawn, when a man stood naked before a basin, scraping away the last bit of himself, not for ego, but for order, for the gods, for Ma'at. And so, the question lingers, when the temples fell, and the old gods faded, and when Egypt was ruled by new empires with new gods and new ideas, did anyone remember to shave? Or did the razors dull in silence, and the world become just a little more chaotic? You've seen the reliefs. The quiet priest, hands folded, bald head gleaming under the hot Egyptian sun. You've heard of their discipline, the daily rituals, the purification, the silence, but you may not know this. He didn't shave himself, at least. Not always in the sprawling network of temple life in ancient Egypt, amidst the scribes, the grain keepers, the linen washers, and the animal tenders, there existed a lesser-known caste, a guild so quiet and specific that their names were rarely carved on walls, but their work was felt in every sacred moment. They were called simply the smooth ones, Nahum in the ancient tongue. The temple barbers, their job, to keep the priests clean, not just symbolically, but physically, totally. obsessively each morning. Before the sunrise gilded the top of the pylons, before the gates of the sacred precinct were unbarred and the offerings weighed, these men worked by the basins, with copper blades, with hands steady and eyes focused. They had to be quiet. The morning rituals forbade noise. They had to be fast. A temple might have dozens of priests rotating through duties, all of whom needed to be shaved before entering sacred space, and they had to be perfect. A single missed hair, a cut too deep, or a reused razor could mean impurity. Impurity could mean rejection. Rejection could mean catastrophe. The barbers were not artists. They were ritual technicians, but who trained them? Not just anyone could pick up a razor and run it across the back of a priest's knee. The work required trust, knowledge, and ritual, training of its own. These barbers were not temple outsiders. They were often minor priests themselves, apprenticed in the art of ritual shaving before ever touching skin. Records from the Middle Kingdom hint at specialized schools within large temple complexes. These weren't like formal academies, more like guilds embedded inside the temple staff hierarchy. Barbers taught barbers, and more importantly, they passed on what not to do. Never start at the head. Always begin with the feet and move upward. Shave in straight lines, not in circles. Rinse the blade after every 3 strokes. Burn the linen used to dry the blade. Whisper the breath prayer, Nifrit Sekin, meaning clean strength, once under your breath before touching skin. Most of these rituals aren't written anywhere. They live in temple memory, passed from hand to hand. Just like the razors, archaeologists have uncovered bundles of ancient shaving kits, bronze blades, bone-handled razors, smooth pebbles for exfoliating the skin, and vessels for oils and powders. But here's what's interesting. They were stored together, carefully, as if sacred, as if they weren't just tools. Kalisma, the smooth ones believed, and perhaps rightly so, that time itself depended on their work. In ancient Egypt, ritual didn't just represent time, it created it. Every morning, as the priests enacted the awakening of the god inside the inner shrine, they were repeating the original sunrise, the first morning, the rebirth of creation. And just as the god emerged from darkness, so too did the priest need to emerge from hair. Hair was chaos. Hair was animal. Hair was yesterday. To be clean-shaven was to be now. And who made that possible? The smooth ones, not through magic, not through power, but through endless repetition. Every temple had a calendar, complex ones, lunar, solar, administrative, agricultural, and yet the deepest rhythms were not marked in papyrus scrolls or astronomic tables. They were marked in stubble, because a priest who had not been shaved could not perform the rites. And if the rites were not performed, the sun might not rise, at least. That's how the logic of cosmic maintenance worked. You might think this is superstition, but remember, in Egypt, math was not automatic. The world did not keep spinning because of physics. It kept spinning because people shaved, prayed, sprayed, and offered bread to gods made of stone. And so, behind every ritual, there were the barbers, not in the carvings, but always there. They often worked in pairs. One shaved, the other handed blades, prepared oils, and wiped sweat. They worked in the cool half-light of stone rooms. Their fingers were trained to be silent. Their eyes learned to look not at the man, but at the hair. It was a strange intimacy. A man kneeling before another, eyes closed, trusting a blade to trace the curve of his skull, not out of submission, but out of necessity. Some priests hated it. They flinched, complained, swore quietly when the blade caught a patch of dry skin, but others found it meditative. The shave was their gateway into ritual time, a moment of enforced stillness before the flood of incense and words. And some were former barbers themselves. They knew the rhythm, the rasp, the weight of the razor. These men, when retired or promoted, often trained the next generation. But here's something stranger still. There are temples where barbers were granted limited access to the sanctuary, normally forbidden to lay people. These sacred spaces were opened to a select few smooth ones, those whose hands were considered clean enough to touch not only the skin of priests, but sometimes the linens of the god. We have no names, no biographies, but a broken ostracon found in Abydos contains a short line. He shaved the priest of Osiris for 47 seasons. No name, no date, just that. A lifetime of invisible work, condensed to a single scratched phrase on pottery. And yet, isn't that how all rhythm makers live? Unseen, unnamed, but always present. So when you think of ancient Egypt, try to remember not just the pharaohs or the pyramids. Think of the man crouched over a basin in the half-light, whispering a breath prayer, lifting a blade to another man's skin and shaving away the yesterday so the god might wake again. Because in that motion, quiet and precise, the world was reborn. But what happened when the blade slipped? Or when the hand grew old and unsteady? Who inherited the razors when a smooth one died? And what of the one who chose never to train an apprentice? That is where we'll go next. The copper blades dulled over time. Not all at once, not dramatically, just a little each day. A little more drag on the skin, a little less clean with each stroke. The edge losing its bite, and the hand that held it, the same hand that had once shaved the high priest of Kama without drawing a drop of blood, that hand began to tremble. It happened slowly, and everyone pretended not to see it, because in temple life, cage was not always honored with rest. The smooth ones, once initiated, were not easily replaced. Their work wasn't just technical, it was ritual, muscle memory, a style, a rhythm, something that couldn't be taught with words. So when the elder barber of the temple of Ammon, a man called Panayamu, he who was smooth, began to hesitate before beginning the sacred morning shaves, the others did what temple staff had always done. They waited longer in line. They whispered in the corridor. They averted their eyes when the priest flinched. But still, Panamu came to the basin every morning. Still, he unfolded the linen cloth. Still, he whispered his breath prayer. Until one day, a cut bled. It was small, hardly anything, scratch under the chin of a lector priest. His job was to recite the day's sacred hymns before the statue of Ammon. But the blood stained the linen collar of the pure white robe. The lector priest was not allowed into the inner shrine that day. The sacrifice had to be delayed, the incense unlit, the hymn unsung. The sky did not fall, but everyone noticed. That evening, a meeting was held in one of the side chambers near the temple treasury. Not a formal one. Barbers were not senior enough for that, but a quiet meeting between Panayamu and two of his junior apprentices. He said nothing of the cut, nothing of the delay. He simply rolled up his shaving kit, polished the copper blade, and laid it into the young man's hands. "Feel the weight," he said. It wasn't a lesson. It was a passing dot in ancient Egypt. Most professions moved through bloodlines. Sons became scribes because their fathers were scribes. Linen makers taught their daughters to weave. But in the case of the smooth ones, that wasn't always the way. Hands, not lineage, decided who became a barber. There were even instances noted in the temple scrolls of Heliopolis of slaves being freed and trained as barbers after showing steady fingers while oiling the priest's feet. If your hands didn't shake, if your breath was even, and if you understood silence, you could learn. So apprenticeships were informal. But serious. Panayamu's replacement was a boy named Menkapper, a temple orphan, born of a kitchen servant and left in the care of linen women. He had shaved wooden dolls as a child, then the arms of a dying priest, then, finally, a priest himself. And so, the work continued. The smooth ones always planned for failure, because when you're dealing with a world where one missed ritual can derail the movement of the cosmos, you have to build in redundancy. This was something outsiders never understood about Egyptian religion. They called it obsessive, but to the people who lived it, it was protective. A buffer against chaos. So if one barber failed, another would step in. But even backup plans required training. And that's where the guilds came in at Karnak, the largest religious complex in Egypt. An entire quarter near the sacred lake was reserved for purification. Here, not only did the priests wash before entering sacred space, but the barbers also lived, practiced, and passed down their craft. There were carved benches, worn smooth from generations of shaving, niches in the walls for razors, scorch marks where used linen towels were burned, and on one stone lintel, barely visible now after centuries of wind, a scratched image of a razor crossed over a reed pen. It meant precision over poetry. The barbers were not praised in songs, but they were respected, quietly, and when one died, his blade was buried with him. Not because it was valuable, but because it remembered his hand. No one else should use it, except there were exceptions. In the temple of Sobek, the crocodile god, an elderly barber once passed without an apprentice. His death caused panic. Rituals backed up. Priests refused to enter the Holy of Holies unshaven. For 2 days, the god remained undisturbed. Then, a decision was made. His blade was exhumed with prayers, with incense, with apologies, and a young novice, barely 14, with trembling hands and eyes wide with fear, was handed the blade of the dead. He performed the shave. It was imperfect. The lines were not straight. The angles were rushed. But there was no blood. And when the sun rose the next day, and the god was dressed in fresh linens, everyone exhaled. From then on, the second set of razors was always prepared, hidden, blessed, but ready, because the world, they realized, was too fragile to hang on a single hand. But what happened when the smooth ones made mistakes on purpose? When, for political reasons, a ritual needed to be delayed? What if the cut was meant to happen? It began with a whisper in the shade of a column. The gossip traveled slowly, not like wind, but like dust settling into corners, quiet, almost invisible, until someone coughed. The rumor was this, that a priest at the temple of Thoth had been intentionally nicked during his purification. Not just any priest, Kala Kir, a man whose duty it was to read the divine scripts aloud, whose voice carried through the limestone halls like flowing honey, coaxing the gods from sleep. And not just any cut, a visible one, just below the chin, close enough to the artery that someone more cynical than the average scribe might call it a warning. But here is the thing. Egyptian temples were ruled by protocol. Every act of ritual, every utterance, every motion of hand and brush and blade was mapped against the calendar of stars in the flow of the Nile. But even within that rigid framework, there was room for maneuvering, for delay, for pause, and barbers had access. They were the first to touch the priest each morning, the first to see the bags under their eyes, the swell of resentment, the signs of illness or political stress, the first to know when a ritual might go wrong, and the first to be asked to help delay it. All it took was one stroke to close. Too slow, a tremor of the wrist. The High Lector of Thoth had recently opposed a new appointment to the treasury, a cousin of the vizier. He had spoken against it during the festival of the moon. The timing was awkward. The political winds were changing, and his voice was beginning to stand out too sharply. The next morning, shaved as usual, but the razor, the one prepared by a young apprentice known to favor the treasury officials, had a slight warp, a curve, just enough to cause drag. The nick wasn't deep, just enough blood to stain his collar, but it disqualified him from entering the Hall of Writings that day. Ritual purity required unbroken skin. The gods, it was said, disapproved of blood unless it was their own offering. And just like that, the day's reading of the renewal scrolls was delayed. The new appointment went through. No more complaints came from the High Lector. He stepped down quietly a few weeks later. This is where the smooth ones became more than servants. They became instruments, and every instrument has a tuning. There are records, barely disguised in the scrolls of the temple scribes at Abydos, notes left in the margins of ritual rosters. One such annotation reads, Lector, disqualified blemish during shaving, replace with second voice. Another entry says, purification failed. Delay procession by one cycle. The scribes did not speculate, but those in the know understood. Barbers had their own language. A scratch on the linen, pause before a second stroke. Fold a towel placed with the edge inward rather than outward. These were signals, not formal, but understood, and sometimes to preserve the appearance of divine order. A ritual had to be adjusted from the shadows. Let us not romanticize this. It was not always about justice. Sometimes it was simply about timing. Imagine a scribe racing to finish the final copy of a scroll before a festival. He needs more time. He asks a friend, a barber, to help. Just a minor delay, just a shallow scratch, a harmless blemish. The ritual is postponed. Scroll is finished. Or imagine a priest, afraid of being found out, his debts growing, his favor fading. He whispers to the smooth one, let me rest today, let the gods wait. And so they wait. One razor stroke holds back the sun. In this way, smooth ones didn't just shave skin, they trimmed time itself. And yet, there was a limit. One day in the year of the high inundation, during the festival of renewal in Thebes, a junior barber made a mistake, a real one. His hands were slick with nervous sweat. The priest in front of him was elderly, with papery skin. He cut too deep, not fatal, but deep enough to require stitches. The priest could not walk for several days. The festival was interrupted. Offerings backed up. The gods, it was feared, were insulted. The barber was brought before the tribunal of temple overseers. He expected exile, perhaps worse, but instead, they did something far crueler. They made him shave animals every day. Donkeys, goats, cattle, not for ritual, for testing to perfect the blade. It was considered a punishment, not because the work was dirty, but because it removed him from the divine. The ritual razors were to be used only on priests. To touch anything else with them was desecration. They gave him new blades, cruder ones, and they watched. For a year, he practiced, and when he returned, he said nothing. He shaved better than he ever had, but he never again spoke during the morning ritual. The gods, it seemed, had forgiven, but not forgotten. And what of the razors themselves? They were not all copper. Some were bronze, in later dynasties, even gold, but those were symbolic. Too soft for real use. Each blade had to be sharpened daily, toned against smooth stones, washed in natron, oiled to keep from rusting. And when one dulled beyond repair, it was melted down and remade into something new. But not just anything. Often, the metal was recast into miniature offerings, small hands, tiny ears, and given to the temple as representations of service. In this way, the razor became eternal. It touched flesh, then time, then symbol. And it is possible, though we cannot know, that in the tombs of forgotten priests, beneath the dust and shattered ashaptis, lie the melted memories of these blades, still smooth, still silent, still waiting for the next ritual to begin. In ancient Egypt, time began before sunrise, not for the masses. The farmers, the water bearers, the scribes, they rose with the light or slightly before it. Their days began with the call of birds or the rhythm of the Nile's flood. But for the priests, especially those in service at Karnak, Luxor, or the house of Ammon, the day started in pitch blackness. Tia, the temple corridors were hushed. Torches had not yet been lit. Incense did not yet curl through the air. And deep within the cold stone chambers of preparation, a man would be waiting naked, silent, shivering slightly in the pre-dawn chill. He was not a slave, not a servant, not a king. He was a priest of the divine, and he was not yet clean. That would change with the first scrape of copper against skin. Imagine it. The walls are made of sandstone, carved with scenes of gods who never sleep. Even in the darkness, their presence is felt, arms crossed, eyes open, watching. The floor beneath the priest's feet is smooth and cold. A shallow basin nearby contains water drawn the night before, filtered through linen and cooled under the stars. There are no words spoken. The barber or shaver called Nesu, a term of both simplicity and subtle respect, approaches with a small tray. Upon it, a copper razor, burnished and sharp, cloth soaked in warm oil, a cup of natron, hell in a white linen wrap for when the shaving is done. The ritual must proceed exactly. First, the priest bows his head slightly, not in greeting, but in submission to the process. The Nesu begins with the crown. The scalp must be perfectly bare. Every hair is an impurity, every follicle a potential seat of uncleanness. Egyptian cosmology placed heavy emphasis on bodily purity. Hair, especially hair that could trap dirt, sweat, insects, or disease, was viewed with suspicion. Priests had to remove all of it from every inch of skin, not just the head, not just the beard, but also the chest, the arms, the legs, the groin, the back, the feet. And each of these areas had to be shaved daily. Not once a week, not every few days. Every single day, because the gods required nothing less. The process took nearly an hour, depending on the priest's build and hair type. Some had coarser hair and required multiple passes of the razor. Others had smoother skin, and the blade glided easily. But in all cases, the goal was the same: absolute smoothness, not for vanity, not for comfort, but to avoid divine contamination. Egyptian belief held that impurity, sfit, was not just physical filth, but spiritual imbalance. It was the opposite of met, the harmony that governed all things: justice, balance, truth, and order. Hair, left to grow unchecked, could harbor isfit, and so it had to be removed. But here's the part that many find strange. The shaving was not done by the priest himself. That would imply self-sufficiency. And the priest, upon entering the presence of the gods, had to be as vulnerable and dependent. As a child, he could not simply make himself pure. Someone else had to cleanse him. Thus, the Nesu, the shaver, was a priest in his own right, often of lower rank, but ritually trained. He was not merely a barber. He was a gatekeeper. Without his work, the higher priests could not enter the inner sanctum. The rituals would not proceed till the offerings would not be made. A bad shave could delay an entire religious schedule. Imagine being the one holding the blade. Your hands must not shake. Your heart must not race. One nick, even a shallow one, and the priest was considered blemished. He would be forbidden from temple duties for the day. Another would have to take his place. There are records of days when ceremonies were canceled entirely due to shaving accidents. And the gods, while patient in myth, were not always forgiving in ritual. There's an inscription on the walls of the Temple of Esna that speaks of the man who cut too deep and let blood into the sanctuary. He is not named. His punishment is not recorded. But the inscription ends with a warning: let the razor be steady, for time waits for no impurity. So shaving was not just grooming, it was the very first step in a cosmic ballet. And it happened in darkness. The Nesu had to know the body of the priest by memory, contours of his scalp, the slope of his jaw, the planes of his thighs and ribs. Light was minimal, if present at all. Most relied on oil lamps or the faintest flickers of starlight entering from high slits in the stone. The silence was sacred. Some described it as the moment between time and voice, a space before the day truly began, when the breath of the gods could still be felt rising from the deep places of the earth, and all the while the gentle scritch of copper on flesh. Sometimes the priest winced, not from pain, but from the cold. Other times he wept again, not from discomfort, but from the gravity of it all. To be shaved was to become less human, more vessel, less a man of earth, more a conduit for divine presence. And what happened? After, once the shaving was done, the priest would be washed with water mixed with natron and lotus oil, then dried with fresh cloth, then dressed in pure linen robes, white and pleated, stiffened with starch. He would then be anointed with scented oil, frankincense, myrrh, blue lotus. Only then was he considered ready to enter the temple's inner court, and even then he had not yet eaten. Priests could not eat before rituals, not even a drop of water, only after the morning offerings were made. And the statues of the gods had been clothed and perfumed. Could the priests partake of the sacred bread? But none of that, none of it, could happen without the blade. It was always the first act, the act that said, "We are not animals. We are not slaves to dirt or hair or impulse. We are smooth. We are clean. We are sacred." And yet, what did it feel like, day after day, to rise before the sun, to expose every inch of yourself, to be scraped and scoured and oiled, to feel less like a person and more like a statue in the making? Did some of them dream of hair? Did they wake in panic, thinking they had missed a patch? Did they sneak looks at their arms during prayer, fearing a single missed follicle? There are notes in the letters of one priest. It's found in the temple complex at Medinet Habu. He writes, "I dream often that I am covered in fur, that the gods laugh when they see me, that I cannot find a razor, yet my own hands are too dull to cut. I wake weeping, and the shaver tells me I was already smooth." And so we must ask, what was this all for? What balance was being maintained? And what did it cost them? In privacy, in pride, in personhood. The blade was sharp, the hands were skilled, but even the steadiest shave could not cut away the weight of being human. The sun had not yet risen, but the air inside the temple had changed. Outside, the Nile whispered its endless song to the reeds. A donkey stirred in the courtyard. Somewhere in the distance, a woman called out to her child, or perhaps to thee, "Wine," and then was quiet again. But inside the sacred halls of Karnak, the shaving was done. The priest now stood cloaked in linen, skin freshly oiled, face gleaming in the torchlight like polished alabaster. He was, for the moment, as close to perfection as a man could be. Hairless, breathless, wordless, he was not alone. Other priests gathered in similar states of preparation. They had all undergone the same process, the careful ritual of hair removal, the anointing, the purification through water and natron. They had not spoken to one another. Words would return only after the gods had been greeted, after the temple had been stirred from its slumber. Until then, they were silent instruments. Stillness was its own liturgy. But what most people never learn, what escapes the grand carvings and survives only in notes left by scribes and fragments, buried under layers of sand, is that the daily shaving of the priests was not merely about cleanliness or obedience. It was about becoming less visible, less real in the worldview of ancient Egypt. To be real, to be made of flesh, blood, hair, and bone, was to decay, to rot, to smell. The gods, by contrast, were unchanging, eternal, pristine. Their statues never grew old. Their forms, however, carved in stone or cast in gold, were always perfect. Thus, the priest had to approximate that divine perfection. Here was the marker of time. It grew, it tingled, turned gray, it fell out, but a shaved body denied that passage. It interrupted time, froze it, only for a day. There's a rare fragment from the Temple of Hybus that reads, "Let the priest be as unchanging as the moon in its fullness. Let his limbs bear no mark of age, no fur of decay. Let the God see in him, not a man, but a mirror." That was the true point of shaving, to become a mirror. But mirrors are dangerous things, because sometimes they reflect too much. Not every priest adapted easily to the constant erasure of the self. The high priests, those trained from boyhood, learned to dissociate. They spoke of the body in the third person. The limbs must be cleansed. The chest must be oiled. Never my arms, never my face. Even their names were sometimes shed in favor of titles. Servant of Amen, keeper of the perfume, voice of the east wind. But among the lower ranks, the temple assistants, the purifiers, the Wabbit priests who only entered the outer sanctums, there were cracks. Shaving could become a private torment. There's a papyrus from the 20th dynasty that describes a priest who refused to be shaved after a fever. He claimed that his soul had been weakened and that to lose his hair now would be to lose the last thread of his strength. He was removed from his position within a week. In another record, a young priest at Dendora reportedly carved small hieroglyphs into his own skin, invisible under normal light, revealed only when rubbed with ochre. It was his way of marking himself in a world where identity was constantly scraped away. And yet, the rituals endured, because the danger of impurity was real, not just symbolically, but biologically. Egypt was a land of heat and insects, of open-air rituals and shared spaces. A priest with body hair might carry lice, might sweat excessively, might contaminate the sacred oils by requiring daily shaving. The temples also protected their sanctity in a practical sense, but the process was relentless. Each day, the priest would wake before dawn. Each day, he would be stripped bare. Each day, he would stand still while another man drew a blade across his skin. Each day, it would be made new, and each day, he would begin again. The psychological toll of this routine is rarely discussed, but it emerges in the margins of the text. Priests wrote, not often, but occasionally, about dreams in which they still had beards, or memories of childhood when their mothers braided their hair. One fragment from an elder priest reads, "I dreamed of my brother, the farmer. His arms were thick with sun and hair. He laughed at me. I laughed too. I do not remember what it is. It's to laugh without fear." There is, in that sentence, a profound truth. To be shaved daily was to always be on guard, to live in fear of the missed patch, the small wound, the insect bite that might disqualify you from service. And there were consequences if a priest was found unshaven. Even a single missed hair, he could be barred from temple rituals. His stipend for the day might be withheld. He might be demoted. In some temples, the penalty was more severe. 3 days of isolation, purification, and fasting. The idea was simple. If you cannot maintain your vessel, how can you contain the divine? And so the priests did what they were trained to do. They endured. They let themselves be shaved again and again, till the skin no longer flinched at the blade, until the breath no longer caught at the cold, until the man was gone, the tea, and only the mirror remained. And yet, even the smoothest skin still bore memory of who they had once been, of who they might have become, of the world outside the temple, where hair grew freely and no one measured your purity by the gleam of your shoulder. Did they envy the fishermen on the Nile, the women braiding their daughters' hair the scribes with their ink-stained fingers and their messy curls? Or did they simply forget? There's an inscription in a tomb near Abydos that ends with this line: "He was always clean, but never known." It was meant as praise, but in the quiet hours of the morning, with the blade whispering over skin once more, one wonders if it also carried sadness. The morning offering was finished. The statues had been fed, not with food, but with ritual, bread and wine, incense and oils. The gods had tasted these things, not through mouths, but through intention, through scent, through smoke, through movement. The priest had spoken the words, not his own, but those passed down for generations. Words shaped like keys, unlocking the invisible gates between worlds. Words that meant nothing unless pronounced in the right order, at the right pace, by a man with the right skin. Hairless skin. It was midday. Now, the temple had shifted. The heat clung to the stone, making it sweat. Bees circled lazily near the lotus pool. A scribe brushed a mosquito from his scroll and cursed under his breath, softly, reverently, as if the gods might be listening. Still, the priest stepped into the side chamber to be shaved once more, not because he had grown hair. No, it was too soon for that, but because the ritual demanded cycles. Purity was not a moment, it was a rhythm. One became pure through repetition. One remained pure by surrender. So again, the linen was removed. Again, the blade was dipped in cool water again. The priest was reduced to smoothness. There are records of how carefully this was done. Not just the arms and legs, not just the chest or the scalp, but every crevice of the body. Eyebrows were removed. Even nostril hairs, if noticed, were plucked. The tools varied: copper razors in earlier dynasties, bronze or obsidian blades in others. Some priests used sharpened reeds for delicate areas, or pumice stones to rub away stubble. The most elite priests used a mixture of honey and crushed limestone, a rudimentary depilatory paste, applied, dried, and ripped away in strips. It was not a painless process, but pain was not the point. Pain was simply ignored. One priest from Memphis wrote in a letter to his brother, "On the fourth day, the pain left. On the fifth, so did my sense of time." It's easy to romanticize the life of a temple priest, to imagine it as serene, elevated, surrounded by gold and perfume. And yes, there was beauty. The chanting, the architecture, the slow walk through incense-thick corridors. There were moments of quiet joy, a perfect sunrise caught through a columned courtyard, or the hum of bees around a blooming papyrus. But there was also fatigue in the endless pressure to be something more than human. The priests did not marry, did not touch the dead, did not eat certain foods, did not cry in public unless in ritual mourning. Some began to speak in riddles, others in prayers, even when alone. In one ostracon, a piece of pottery used like scrap paper, a novice priest doodled a small face, bearded, laughing. Underneath, he wrote, "The god does not laugh, the man does. But who is the man now? We don't know his name. Perhaps it was erased. Perhaps he left the order. Or perhaps he simply stopped writing. But his question remains, who is the man now?" Because shaving in this world was not just about physical appearance, it was about layers. Every day, another layer was removed. Not just hair, but memory. Not just stubble, but identity, until the priest became a shape, a role, a silence. And yet, at the end of each day, when the gods had been tended to, when the lamps were dimmed, when the halls echoed with only footsteps and distant birdsong, the priests were allowed a moment of solitude in their quarters. Simple stone rooms with reed mats and small niches. They could sit alone and think, or perhaps remember. There's a fascinating little inscription found at Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who built the tombs of kings. One of the Workers, once a priest, had etched this line above his bed. Today, I wore my own face. It's unclear what it meant. Perhaps he had grown his beard again. Perhaps he had simply smiled, unobserved. Perhaps, for a single day, he had been something other than a mirror. But mirrors, even in rest, remember the faces they've shown. That's the quiet tragedy of these temple priests. They were not forced into servitude. They chose it. They studied for it. They worked for it. They honored it. And in doing so, they gave themselves to something larger than themselves. Not just a god, but an idea. The idea that the world could remain in balance if certain men stayed clean, stayed silent, stayed still. That shaving the body was like sweeping a temple floor, keeping chaos at bay. That removing a single hair could preserve the order of heaven. It's absurd, in a way, okay? And also deeply human, because even now, in our own rituals, shaving before a job interview, cleaning before a ceremony, cleaning up before seeing someone important, we echo those ancient gestures. We still believe that appearances matter, that smoothness means readiness, that presentation is purity. Perhaps we, too, are still priests of something, still scraping away what makes us human in order to be seen as something else, still caught in that ancient game of mirrors. And so, priest, nameless, hairless, eternal, disappears into the silence of the temple, not dead, not forgotten, just invisible. A smooth figure on a wall carving, a face without features, a man who gave everything to make the gods smile, even the last strand of himself. It began not with religion, but with control. Not every ancient Egyptian priest lived in a grand temple, nor served beneath the gaze of immortal statues. Some served the state. Some were not priests in the divine sense at all, but scribes, tax collectors, gatekeepers to the mechanisms of royal power. And for these men, too, the blade was a tool of survival. In the great capital cities, especially during the 18th dynasty, being clean-shaven was more than a spiritual practice. It was a political signal, a uniform of loyalty, a visible sign that a man had been shaped, smoothed, and approved by the machinery of the state. To leave one's hair uncut, to grow a beard, to allow the natural to defy the manicured, was to suggest you were above the rules, or worse. Outside of them, there are records from the reign of Thutmose III that detail inspections of the palace court, including notes on who appeared unshaven or disheveled. These were not simple hygiene concerns. They were warnings. Razor, in this context, was not for cleanliness. It was for discipline. Imagine the scene, a quiet corridor in the palace of Thebes. A junior scribe is called before his superior. He has performed his duties, written the correct lips, filed the correct ledgers, but he is tired. He is not shaved, and so, without anger, without malice, the superior notes this in his report. He was not clean. The scribe is not punished, not at first, but a few weeks later, his name is absent from the registry. He has been reassigned, removed. No one knows for sure. That's the quiet danger of being hairy in a shaved world. You disappear, but this obsession with shaving did not apply equally. The pharaohs, the living gods, were often depicted with beards, false beards, woven and strapped behind the ears, sometimes gilded. These were not indicators of rebellion, but of divine strength. The beard of a king was symbolic, not organic. It was not grown, it was crafted, and only those granted special permission could wear one. To wear hair on one's face, naturally, without license, was, for most men, a mark of informality, even wildness. Foreigners were often depicted as bearded in Egyptian art. Libyans, Asiatics, and Nubians were all drawn with facial hair, signaling their distance from the Egyptian ideal. Hair was not just about aesthetics, it was about boundaries. You could tell who belonged and who didn't by how closely their skin mirrored polished stone. This was especially evident in the bureaucracy. Men who worked in tax offices, grain distribution, record keeping, they were expected to shave, not just to appear neat, but to symbolize that they had been tamed by the system. They were domesticated, reliable, predictable, and this expectation extended beyond the face. It was not uncommon for officials to be instructed to remove arm and leg hair. Even servants who appeared in the presence of high-ranking nobles were expected to appear smooth. There is a note in a surviving papyrus from El Medina that reads, "He came before me with dust on his feet and hair on his arms. I sent him away." We do not know who he was. It's perhaps just a courier. But his body, unshaven, was enough to interrupt the process of governance. This obsession trickled down the social ladder. In the homes of merchants and landowners, small shaving kits were found, complete with razors, whetstones, and mirrors. Even among those not serving temples or the court, the appearance of cleanliness became a kind of armor, a way to move safely through a world where impressions meant everything, but for the very poor. Such rituals were harder to maintain. Razors were not cheap, and water, especially during dry seasons, was precious. So in the villages along the Nile, many men grew beards, not because they wished to rebel, but because shaving was a luxury. And this, too, marked them when they traveled into cities. They were seen differently, treated differently. A man with a beard might be mistaken for a foreigner, or worse, a criminal, a wanderer. A man without ties to temple or tax. In one court record from the reign of Ramesses II, a merchant accused of theft is described as a hairy man with eyes like ash. Whether his guilt was proved or not is unclear, but the record fixates on his appearance. Hair was not just something to be managed, it was something to be feared. And so, shaving became a kind of self-defense. Men who wanted to be accepted too passed through checkpoints to access opportunities, to be treated with dignity, kept razors close. Even travelers carried portable mirrors. Soldiers in the field were inspected, not only for weapons, but for appearance. In one military record, from the reign of Amenhotep II, an officer complains, "The men are tired and bitten by insects, yet I must send to home, for they have not shaved." The gods did not require this case, but the generals did, and perhaps that's the deeper truth. Sometimes the expectations of man were harsher than those of the divine, because while the gods forgave in theory, the state did not. The priests shaved to please the heavens, but the officials shaved to survive. And somewhere, between the blade and the basin, a man's future was shaped in a land of laws and gods. Appearance was more than vanity, it was alignment. To be smooth was to be safe. To be hairy was to be seen as something wild. And yet, isn't that what hair is? A sign that we are part animal, a reminder of our origins, a thread tying us to the wilderness just beyond the Nile. And so, the blade kept rising, day after day, scraping away the parts of us that hinted at chaos, until, finally, a face could pass, not just as Egyptian, but as approved. But what happens when a people begin to shave, not for belief, but for fear? And what parts of themselves are lost in the process? What pieces of identity are washed down the basin each morning with no one watching, no record kept? Just skin, dot, and silence, and the echo of a razor in the distance. The barbers of ancient Egypt did not wield weapons, but their razors drew blood all the same. They were not always priests. They were not always servants. Some were specialists, trained in the art of shaping a face, calming the skin, and navigating the social web that came with handling the heads of powerful men. Their stalls, often just shaded corners of market squares or small rooms behind noble houses, became places of quiet revelation. In the chair, more of a stool, or even a mat, became the site of confessions, because in Egypt, to sit while being shaved was to sit still in vulnerability. A man leaned his neck back, closed his eyes, and trusted the hand of another. And this trust, however ordinary it may seem, was no small gesture in a society layered with suspicion and hierarchy. Among the elite, private barbers were retained like doctors or scribes. Their tools were kept in locked wooden boxes, bronze razors, polished pumice stones, vessels for scented oil, cloths soaked in myrrh and resin. These men were sometimes gifted with rare oils, not for their social standing, but because they touched the faces of those who ruled and information flowed in their direction. Imagine, nobleman sits down in the late afternoon. The court has been tense, a change in taxation or whispers of rebellion. He says nothing to his family, but to the barber. He sighs, he mutters, he lets slip names. The barber says nothing, but remembers everything in time. Even viziers sought out specific barbers, not for the closeness of their shaves, but for their silence. That silence became its own kind of currency. Meanwhile, in the great temples, shaving was sacred. It had to be done before rituals, before entering the inner sanctums. Temple barbers shaved not just faces and heads, but entire bodies, armpits, legs, groins. They did this not in secret, but with solemnity. The process was not erotic. It was erasure of the human, of the unclean, of the animal. A priest of high status would lie down on a clean reed mat. The barber, kneeling, would begin with a chant, not always audible, but murmured, ancient. The blade would pass slowly over the scalp, then the jaw, then the limbs. Afterward, scented oils were applied, frankincense for protection, cloves for purity. The priest would rise, smooth and pale in the torchlight, and enter the presence of the god. But not all shaves were equal. There were hierarchies, even in smoothness. Priests of Ammon, who served in the massive complexes at Karnak, were among the most rigorously shaved, not because Ammon demanded it, but because his cult demanded perfection. His priests were known for their discipline, their distance from the common world. They could not eat in public, they could not weep before men, and they could not, under any condition, allow hair to grow where the sacred had been invited. A rogue strand of hair in a ritual could result in a repeat of the entire ceremony. Worse, it could call into question the purity of the entire priesthood. There were records, brief, cautious of priests being demoted or reassigned over shaving mishaps. One, mentioned only in a fragmentary inscription, was exiled to a lesser temple along the western desert. It was said he had let his beard grow while mourning the gods. Apparently, did not permit mourning with stubble. But while temples enforced shaving as sacred law, the royal court took a different approach, one based on image. The reign of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who briefly replaced the entire pantheon with the worship of Aten. The sun disk marked a strange interlude in Egypt's shaving habits. Akhenaten's portraits show him with elongated features, smooth cheeks, and a body far from the muscular ideal. Some scholars believe these depictions were symbolic. Others think they reflected a real condition. Either way, his imagery removed the traditional beard of kingship. He did not wear the false beard. He appeared bare, human, fragile, and so did his court. During the Amarna period, high officials are often shown without wigs, without beards, their faces long and serene, their skulls exaggerated. In wall paintings, we see whole groups of men, ambassadors, priests, counselors, shaved so cleanly they resemble wax. Perhaps it was a statement. The old gods, with their elaborate headdresses and braided beards, were gone. The new god was light itself, and to worship light, one must become reflective, smooth, without shadow. But Akhenaten's revolution collapsed. The temples returned. The old gods reawakened, and with them, so did the rituals of shaving. Yet one change lingered: the understanding that shaving could be more than ritual. It could be political theater. When Horemheb, a general who later became pharaoh, took the throne, He commissioned statues of himself with and without the false beard. Sometimes he appeared clean-faced, other times with the royal strap. This fluidity allowed him to control how he was seen, as a man of the people or as a god among them. In the city, this flexibility was echoed. Men wore wigs and shaved heads, but in times of mourning, they might remove the wig, not to expose hair, but to expose the smooth scalp beneath, a gesture of humility. Some carved, steely even show entire families, husband, wife, child, all bald, all smooth-faced, a snapshot of loyalty, or perhaps fear, because in the end, that's what much of this was. A way to stay invisible. To be smooth was to slip through scrutiny. No one stopped a clean-shaven man. No one questioned his motives. No one asked why he approached the temple gate or the court archive, but a bearded man. He might be from Nubia or Libya, or worse, an independent thinker. Even Pharaoh Seti I, who restored many traditions lost during the Amarna heresy, issued orders requiring military captains to keep their troops clean-shaven, a sign of unity, of discipline, of Egyptian identity. One tablet found in a border outpost reads, "Let the guards be checked each morning. Let no hair fall on the ground. Let no scent offend the God who watches." Hair was danger. Hair was foreign. Hair was self. And so, the razors moved like clockwork across the Nile, in homes, in palaces, in markets, in temples. The scraping sound never stopped, and the barbers kept cutting, not just hair, but history. Because when a society decides that smoothness is safer than truth, what gets hidden? What remains unshaved, untouched, beneath the surface? And who has the power to decide what must be erased? In the heart of ancient Egypt's temples and palaces, the scraping sound of bronze against skin was more than background noise. Oh, it was an ancient rhythm, deliberate, methodical, and unnervingly quiet. Every stroke of the blade told a story of control, obedience, and the slow erasure of anything that didn't quite belong. But by the time we arrive at the final centuries of the New Kingdom, the role of shaving, once religious, then political, had taken on another layer: social, discipline. It began with expectations to be a priest. You had to be shaven to be a servant of the court. You had to be shaven to serve in the temple. You had to be smooth in every sense of the word, not just physically clean, but socially unthreatening. Care, in all its wild, natural variety, represented something that Egyptian civilization had long tried to control. Chaos, divine order of the universe, was fragile. It could be disrupted by war, flood, famine, or a single strand of hair out of place. The priests knew this. The scribes lived by it. The barbers enforced it. But at what cost? Some records, faint and fragmented, suggest that not everyone embraced this expectation with ease. One papyrus fragment describes a novice priest punished not for a failed recitation or ritual mistake, but for returning to the temple with stubble after a 2-day absence. His punishment was not severe. He was assigned latrine cleaning duty and barred from the sacred library for a month. But the message was clear. Appearance was not superficial. Appearance was sacred. Even children in training were subjected to this. Those enrolled in temple schools had their heads shaved, leaving only the signature sidelock of youth. This wasn't just for hygiene. It was a visible marker of their in-betweenness. Not yet adults, not yet holy, not yet anything. In the margins of some astraca, shards of pottery used for practice writing, we find childish sketches of razor blades, and next to them, small faces, round and blank, without hair. Was it a game or a quiet protest? We can't be sure, but the obsession with shaving continued, even in death. Mummies of priests and nobles were embalmed smooth. Hair was removed during preparation, unless it had symbolic significance, like a wig or false beard. Some burial texts make explicit reference to this. One reads, "Let him not rise with the hair of the earth. Let him be clean as the eye of Horus." Even in the afterlife, the gods expected smooth skin. In tomb paintings, we see figures emerging from the tombs into the fields of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. They are young, idealized, bald, smooth-faced. But these were illusions. The real bodies, those preserved in linen and resin, sometimes tell a different story. Some mummies, when unwrapped, show traces of natural hair left behind under arms, across chests, at the nape of the neck. Perhaps these were missed. Or perhaps, as some scholars suggest, the embalmers grew tired of chasing every last follicle. Or perhaps the person had insisted, "Leave it, let me keep something." These moments, rare, scattered, offer us a glimpse of resistance, because shaving, for all its associations with holiness and hygiene, was also a tool of control. And where there is control, there is resistance. Consider the workers at Deir el-Medina, the artisans who carved and painted the tombs of the Valley of the Kings. They lived in a tightly regulated village with strict schedules, rations, and oversight from the state. They were paid in grain, beer, and fish, and expected to work with loyalty, but even they found ways to push back. Some tomb graffiti shows priests and officials with exaggerated beards and wild hair, clearly satirical. One wall sketch depicts a bald priest fleeing from a swarm of lice, pursued by the gods themselves. Humor here was resistance, and sometimes real defiance emerged. Records from the 20th dynasty describe a minor uprising among temple servants, one triggered, in part, by changes to the shaving rituals. A new overseer had introduced stricter regimens, more frequent shavings, harsher oils, tighter inspections. The servants, many of them elderly or with sensitive skin, protested. They stopped showing up for their purification duties. They claimed injury by blade. It escalated. Petitions were filed. The overseer was reassigned. This was not a revolution, but it was something. Even the elite, at times, bent the rules. During the late periods of Egyptian history, as the country came under the influence of Libyan, Nubian, and eventually Persian rulers, hair returned in strange ways. Some priests began to grow trimmed mustaches, subtle, carefully managed. Others kept stubble on ceremonial days, then shaved clean for major rituals. These choices were not just fashion. They were statements. Egypt, after all, was changing. Foreign rulers brought foreign styles. Persian satraps, who controlled Egypt for a time, often wore beards. And though the Egyptian priesthood largely resisted these trends, some adaptations slipped through. By the time of the Ptolemies, the Greek dynasty that followed, Alexander the Great beards were back at court. Ptolemaic kings styled themselves after Zeus, not Osiris. Hair, once a sign of disorder, became again a symbol of power. But in the temples, still silence, still razors, still smoothness. The priests, desperate to hold on to their shrinking authority, clung to the old ways. They shaved, they oiled, they prepared each morning as if Amen still ruled from Karnak, and the Nile still flowed only under Egyptian control. Perhaps they knew the truth, that in the end, shaving was never about cleanliness. It was about performance. And when the performance ends, when the razors are put away and the mirror is broken, what remains? A face, a history, and perhaps a single stubborn hair left behind in defiance of it all. Long before the scribe dipped his reed in ink, or the high priest raised his arms to greet the morning sun, another figure was already at work behind the curtain of dawn, the temple barber. Silent, precise, and almost invisible in the historical record, he held no titles of grandeur, no scrolls of theology. But without him, the rituals of the gods could not begin. His task was deceptively simple: to remove hair. Yet, In the cosmology of ancient Egypt, this act, the gliding of a blade over flesh, was as sacred as any prayer. The temple barber was not merely a servant. He was the keeper of purity. In his hands, a razor became a ritual object, a tool not of vanity, but of transformation. And every cut he made helped bridge the space between the human and the divine. Our story begins not with the high priests of Karnak or the pharaohs of legend, but with the quieter place, a small provincial temple in Middle Egypt. Nestled near the bend of the Nile, far from the political drama of Thebes or Memphis, it is the 18th dynasty, around 1450 BCE, a time of wealth, of expansion, of empire. And yet, here in this modest temple dedicated to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing, the daily rituals begin in stillness. The temple opens before sunrise. The air is cool, the floors swept clean by acolytes just before midnight. The doors to the inner sanctum, where the statue of Thoth rests, remain closed, sealed with linen and wax. Only after purification can the priests enter, and purification begins with the blade. The barber arrives before the others. His tools are kept in a cedar box, lined with fine linen, wrapped in cloths, perfumed with frankincense. Bronze razors, curved delicately like the crescent moon, rest beside flat pumice stones, reeds for applying oils, and bowls of cooled water drawn from the sacred well. The first priest, a man nearing 50 with thinning hair and deep lines carved into his face from years of ritual recitation, sits silently on a stool. His eyes do not meet the barber's. They need not. There is a long history between them, not of friendship, not even of familiarity, but of repetition, of trust placed in quiet hands. The barber begins with the scalp, wetting the hair with lotus-scented water, softening the strands. The bronze blade sings softly against the skin, stroke after stroke. No nicks, no blood. The skin must be smooth, untouched by injury, for to draw blood would render the purification incomplete. The face is next, cheeks, chin, upper lip, then arms, chest, back, underarms. Every part of the body exposed by the priest's linen. Robes must be cleared. Pubic hair is last a most sensitive task, and one done with the utmost discretion. A separate cloth is used. Special oil is applied, cooling the skin. The priest remains dignified throughout, his gaze fixed on a painted column, reciting the words of the day's first hymn silently in his mind. When the shaving is done, the barber pours water over the priest's body, pats it dry, hands him a small clay vessel of natron powder. A final purification step. The priest dresses. The next man sits, and so the cycle begins again. In one morning, the barber may shave 6 or more priests. Each must be cleansed before they approach the god. Each body must be transformed from mortal to ritual vessel. But what of the barber himself? He does not enter the sanctuary. He does not chant hymns or offer incense. His hands prepare others to do so, but he remains on the threshold. And yet, there is something sacred in his silence. Barbers in ancient Egypt were not necessarily from the priestly caste. Some were born into their trade, taught by fathers or uncles who worked near the temples or in the courts. But those who shaved the priests had to be more than skilled. They had to be clean, obedient, and above all, invisible. They were expected to live near the temple, avoid forbidden foods, and observe partial ritual purity. Some had wives and children. Others lived alone in small reed huts, their tools guarded like relics. Occasionally, they shaved the heads of noble children entering temple schools, or prepared the bodies of the dead, ensuring they were clean for the journey into the afterlife. In both cases, their razors touched those bound for divine contact, either in life or in death. Some inscriptions refer to them obliquely, he who prepares the faces of the pure. Others call them by a formal term, seshnaktet, which loosely translates to scribe of the blade. Not a literal scribe, perhaps, but one who etched meaning into flesh through motion, through the art of removal. And yet their names are rarely recorded, like the servants who swept the temple floors or lit the early morning fires. They were essential and invisible, but occasionally catch glimpses. A limestone stela from the reign of Thutmose III shows a barber named Neferhotep offering a bowl of ointment to a seated priest. The caption reads, "He who makes pure the skin of the speaker of Thoth." A small honor, a small moment, but one that suggests pride, identity, and perhaps even reverence in a different temple. Farther north, a list of temple workers includes one Hekamwaset, cutter of the holy hair. No other details are given, no lineage, no age, just a role. Perhaps that's all that mattered, because to be a temple barber was not about ego, was about the discipline of touch. A priest might offer prayers, a scribe might record the will of the gods, but the barber prepared the body, and the body in Egyptian theology was everything. Without the body, there was no vessel for the Ka, the vital spirit. Without the body, there was no offering, no gesture, no speech. And without purification, without the removal of the worldly, the body remained too human, too flawed to serve. So the barber became the unseen architect of the divine day. He set the tone, he marked the boundary, he ensured the priest was ready, not through words, but through skin. And when his work was done, he packed his tools, cleaned his hands with natron, and stepped away. No applause, no blessing, just silence, okay? And the distant sound of the temple doors opening as the rituals began. But even as we move forward into the next phase of this story, where politics, prestige, power begin to threaten the quiet of sacred routine, it's worth asking, what happens when those who serve the servants of the gods begin to question their place? Does the blade, so often used for purification, ever become a tool of protest? And in a world obsessed with smoothness, what happens when someone chooses to let the hair grow? The Nile was steady that year, neither too generous nor too stingy. It rose with grace, filled the fields, and retreated like clockwork. But inside the temples, a different kind of rhythm began to falter. Priests who once recited hymns without pause now paused too long. Acolytes whispered to one another in the corridors, and even the temple barbers, those quiet men whose bronze blades glinted at dawn, began to sense that change was coming. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even clear, but it was as certain as the tide curling beneath the rituals and hierarchies that had remained untouched for generations. In Thebes, the great temple of Amun-Re saw new scribes replacing old ones. Tax records were lost or rewritten. Priestly appointments shifted from merit to favor. Politics crept into purity like smoke under a door. And then there were the barbers. Men like Jedmont, who had shaved the same chief lector priest for 19 years without ever once cutting his skin. Jedmont had trained his nephew, a clever boy named Senab, in the arts of calmness, or control, of the perfect diagonal stroke beneath the chin. Senab had hands like reeds in the wind, light, subtle, precise. And yet, there was something in his eyes that the old man noticed. Ambition, not the kind that seeks wealth, but the kind that seeks recognition. A desire to step beyond the linen curtain, to be seen not just as a servant, but as someone essential. And perhaps he was, but there was no path for a barber to become a priest. Not even the best shaven skin could grant him that. Still, Senab watched. He listened. He noticed which priests were falling out of favor and which merchants visited the temple too often. He learned who controlled the flow of natron, of scented oils, of temple linen. And slowly, quietly, he began to trade information, not out of betrayal, not at first, but because no one else paid attention to the barbers. He heard things as he shaved, the soft sigh of a priest complaining about a governor's tax increase, the mumbled name of a concubine uttered while half asleep in the chair, the nervous cough of a scribe whose scrolls had gone missing. And Senab remembered everything at night. While others slept, he etched small notes onto scrap shards of pottery, astraka, and hid them in a jar beneath his cot. It began with harmless gossip, then turned into leverage. Soon, Senab could influence which priests were delayed in their morning shaving, a delay that meant missing the most prestigious rituals. He suggested to a senior priest that his rival's skin was developing a rash unfit for purity. He accidentally dulled his blade just before a ceremony, assuring the priest would appear less than perfectly shaven. And still, no one questioned the barber. Meanwhile, Jedmot watched with unease. He had lived his life by the rules: quiet service, clean razors, respect for the line between sacred and secular. But his nephew was rewriting the ritual with whispers. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the pylons of the temple, Jedmot confronted Senab. "You are not a priest," he said simply. "You are the one who makes them ready. That is enough." But Senab only smiled. "They have forgotten what readiness means," he replied. "And that means they have forgotten our power." Was he wrong? It was an old question in Egypt: who truly held power? The pharaoh, the priests, the scribes, or those who served them in silence? And when silence became a strategy, did it not count as speech? In the city of Heliopolis, another barber, a woman named Nebeta, rare in her trade, but respected for her skill, found herself caught in a similar web. She served the priestesses of Hathor, goddess of love and beauty. Her job was not just to shave, but to maintain the appearance of ritual perfection. Plucked brows, polished skin, smooth limbs. She worked behind a beaded curtain, in a room scented with blue lotus and myrrh, and she too began to hear things. Unlike Senab, Nebeta did not seek influence. She sought justice. She had seen too many young girls dismissed from temple service after a single pimple or minor skin blemish. She had seen priests allow favored daughters to skip purification entirely, while others were punished for the faintest stray hair. So she kept her own records quiet, private, written in coal on palm leaf scraps. When the priestess of Hathor was accused of impiety, Nebeta produced a list of every violation she had silently observed. It wasn't official, it wasn't legal, but it was enough to shift opinion. A barber's testimony, even in whispers, could stain a reputation forever. Back in Thebes, Senab continued his quiet ascent. When one high priest fell ill, it was Senab who recommended a replacement, a man who owed him a favor. When a scribe went missing, it was Senab who revealed that the man had fled to Memphis with stolen temple funds. Senab never raised his voice. He never left his station. But one by one, the rituals bent toward him. The blade had become a key, and yet it was still just a blade. It could cut both ways. Jedmot, growing old and weary, wrote a letter to the temple council. He warned them that the purity of the priesthood was being compromised, not by outside enemies, but from within, through small compromises, delayed rituals, and barbers who knew too much. The letter was ignored. A month later, Jedmot was found dead in his quarters. Natural causes, they said. But the jar of his razors was missing. No one accused Senab. No one dared. But from that day forward, he was known among the temple workers as the quiet wind, invisible, yet everywhere. And still, each morning, the shaving continued. Priests still sat on the stool. Razors still glided along their skin. Bowls of warm water still steamed gently in the cold morning light. The rituals remained, but something had shifted. The line between service and power had blurred. The barber, once an invisible functionary, had become a gatekeeper, a manipulator, recorder of sins. But the question remained. In a system built on purity, what happens when the purifiers themselves are no longer pure? What happens when the hand that prepares the face of the divine begins to tilt the mirror. And can a razor meant to smooth become the tool that exposes everything jagged beneath? In the final years of the 19th dynasty, as the divine kingship of Egypt grew increasingly fragile and the borders strained against foreign pressure, the inner sanctums of the temples remained stubbornly committed to appearances. The purity of ritual had to be maintained, no matter the civil unrest, no matter the invasions. The gods still needed their offerings, and the priests, those weary men clinging to their roles, still needed their skins smoothed, brows shaped, and their bodies purged of any sign of worldliness. It was the barbers who made this possible, not because they were celebrated or thanked or even acknowledged, but because they understood that silence is a kind of power and routine a kind of religion. Sinab now oversaw not just the shaving of priests in Thebes, but also the training of barbers in Abanas and Karnak. He had written anonymously, of course, a guide for the temple barber: how to sharpen razors with volcanic pumice, how to mix oil with natron to reduce irritation, how to detect early signs of disease on the skin before they disrupted sacred proceedings. But his most important teaching wasn't about the body, it was about the ear. Listen more than you shave, he wrote. A cut heals, a whisper never does. It became an unofficial mantra among temple barbers across the Nile Valley. At the same time, Sinab's name began appearing in places it should not have. Scribes in Memphis reported requests for the Theban hand, his secret moniker, to be summoned for high initiations. A governor's wife in Elephantine claimed she was only properly anointed after receiving Sinab's final cut. He had become more than a barber, had become myth, but power has a scent, and soon others began to follow it. In the temple courts, junior priests whispered about the razor circle, an invisible web of barbers who, through their knowledge and discretion, held the true reins of temple hierarchy. Was it conspiracy, paranoia, or simply recognition of a truth long ignored? Either way, a reckoning began to brew. In the city of Edfu, a young priest named Enahi filed a formal complaint. He claimed that the temple barber, a man named Patapet, had manipulated the rotation schedule to ensure certain priests always served in the more prestigious morning rites, while others were relegated to evening duties. The charge was small, but significant. It implied corruption of ritual order and near heretical accusation. An investigation followed. When officials questioned Patapet, he offered no denial. Instead, he placed a single piece of ostrakhan on the table, a shard of pottery inscribed with a note from a senior priest, asking for special treatment in exchange for temple supplies. The officials blinked. This wasn't just about one barber. It was a system, quiet, meticulous, and deeply embedded, and it had been tolerated for decades. The matter was buried, but fear had entered the temples in Memphis. A priest's throat was accidentally cut during shaving, the first such incident in over 20 years. Rumors spread that the razor slipped, not by mistake, but by warning. No evidence supported this claim, but once the idea was loose, it didn't matter. Trust began to fray. Back in Thebes, Sinab felt the shift. He had built his empire in shadows, with precision, with restraint. But now, the blades were being noticed. So he did what few men in his position could. He withdrew. He returned to his old quarters behind the House of Life, where he resumed the simple work of cleaning razors and training novices. His absence was felt more than his presence. Decisions slowed. Rituals became clumsy. Shaving incidents increased. And yet, the temples remained standing. The gods still received their offerings. The priests still walked the halls with smooth cheeks and bare scalps. But something had changed. The trust was gone. The silence, once sacred, had become suspect in his final years. Sinab was visited by a young girl named Hepsha, the daughter of a weaver newly apprenticed to the priestesses of Mut. She came to learn the art of shaving, not as vanity, but as duty. She believed in the ritual, believed that to prepare the body for service was a noble act. Senna taught her everything: how to hold the blade like a reed, how to measure the breath of a client for the first stroke, how to remain invisible and indispensable at the same time. And then, one morning, as the sun crept over the pylons of Karnak, he placed a final gift in her hand, a small, rounded stone, polished smooth from decades of sharpening razors. "This," he said softly, "is the only mirror that matters. Not what others see, but what you feel in the hand." She understood. Senab died a week later. No ceremony, no mourning rites, just a quiet disappearance behind the linen curtain. Hepsha took his place. She never manipulated schedules, never whispered secrets, but she kept the mirror stone in her palm every morning, and her razors, always perfectly honed, became a legend, not for their danger, but for their care. Years later, when an earthquake shook the temple walls and toppled half the northern corridor, the only room left untouched was a small, silent chamber where the barbers trained. Some said it was coincidence. Others said it was a blessing. Either way, the shaving continued, and so did the rituals. And in the quiet between the prayers, between the hymns, between the words of praise, to Ra and Thoth and Isis, you could still hear it. The soft hiss of the razor dot, the whisper of the bowl being filled, the sacred silence of service, enduring longer than anyone imagined.